When we ask if something can be proven, we usually think of the scientific method where scientists collect evidence that you can touch, see, or feel. But is this the only way that we can prove something? Are we born with innate knowledge? John Locke advocates empiricism, which says that we learn everything through our senses. But Gottfried Leibniz rejects this idea and debates against Locke to say that we are born with innate knowledge. Let's see what they have to say. Let's talk about Locke and Leibniz on innate knowledge. First, we'll talk about John Locke's empiricism and what is meant by tabula rasa. Next, we'll talk about Gottfried Leibniz's criticisms of Locke. And then we'll talk about the place of science in philosophy. First, let's look at Locke's empiricism and tabula rasa. How do we learn? Where does knowledge come from? What kind of information counts as good justification for a belief? If you want certain, undoubtable knowledge, what should your starting point be? Plato said that we start with innate ideas, and that all learning is remembrance of some kind, with the addition of deduction. So he focuses on reason as the main way that we learn and that we test knowledge. His student Aristotle critiqued this idea and adjusted it a little bit. He said that we need observation and reason. That starts from sensory experience, but we also use reason. Observation and reason work together as induction and deduction work in the mind to help us learn things. And then later on, much later on, Descartes in the Enlightenment proposed something similar to Plato, saying that we have innate ideas and that we use deduction, which is in reason, in order to learn things, because we cannot trust our sensory experience. So he drops off observation and just preserves reason. John Locke does the opposite. He leaves reason and keeps observation. All right, so Descartes proposes rationalism, and John Locke proposes empiricism, where he says that all knowledge comes from sense experience, that we are born with no innate ideas, which is to say that we are like a blank slate, tabula rasa. That means that we are born not knowing anything, and everything that we learn comes through our sense experience. So right here in Aristotle, you have observation and reason working together, and then in Descartes, you have reason and John Locke, just observation. So in the Enlightenment, observation and reason get separated and presented as opposing foundations for knowledge in rationalism and empiricism. And then later you have Leibniz, who responds to Locke, and he preserves the idea of innate ideas plus deduction, similar to Descartes, but actually more similar to Plato and Aristotle, a sort of recovery of something that was lost. But he does not emphasize observation as much as Aristotle. What is the chief source of knowledge and test for truth? Is it observation or is it reason? Aristotle said it's both observation and reason. Rationalism says it's just reason by itself. Empiricism says that it's just observation or sensory experience. That's the source of knowledge. So everything that we know comes through observation. And how do you test whether or not an idea is true? How do you prove something? Well, you can prove something either with reason or with observation or both together. In the Enlightenment, reason and observation were divorced and presented as enemies instead of working together. Locke's empiricism says that all knowledge comes through sense experience. We are born with no innate knowledge. Tabula rasa is just the idea that our minds are a blank slate or an empty cabinet waiting to be filled by experience. As we experience things in the world, Our mind gets populated with new ideas only through our experience, through our sensory interactions with the world. Here are some counter-arguments that Locke entertains and responds to. Many of these are proposed by Plato and Leibniz. First, some things are universally known, so they must be innate, right? Well, Locke says that this is false. There may be other reasons why certain things are believed by everybody. What about the laws of logic? They can't be denied, therefore they must be innate, right? For example, everybody knows something cannot be both true and false at the same time. So it must be innate ideas. Locke's response is that in fact people do deny these, even if they are wrong. Also, children don't know this. Another criticism or counter-argument says people do not become aware of their innate knowledge, like the laws of logic, until they grow old enough to use abstract reason. Locke's response is that many people who are of age, such as the uneducated, still deny the laws of logic. Another criticism says when children come to understand basic mathematical principles, they immediately accept them, revealing their innate knowledge. Locke responds, saying, on the contrary, actually this just proves that these principles must be learned and are not known innately. Some moral principles are accepted by all people is another criticism, and then Locke's response is that on the contrary, some people are ignorant of even obvious moral truths, like do not murder. In summary, Locke proposes his own particular kind of empiricism, which says that sense experience is the only source of knowledge and test for truth. We know and prove that something is true through the use of our five senses, because that's how we learn. That's where all knowledge comes from. And tabula rasa, which is to say we are born with no innate knowledge as a blank slate. This is to say that a priori reasoning, which is reasoning that does not depend on experience, that's what a priori means. A priori reasoning, according to Locke, and deduction still actually do come from experience and not from innate knowledge. Universal acceptance of ethics or of the laws of logic or of anything, universal acceptance does not imply innate knowledge. It could come from something else. He also says that experience and reasoning are not tools for discovering innate knowledge. Rather, they create knowledge. The influence of Locke's empiricism is naturalism, which is the belief that nothing exists besides the physical world. Another influence is that if you can only learn through your senses and can only improve things and can only prove things through your senses, then we can't learn about any reality besides the physical world. All right? So this is also related to naturalism. Another influence is that the modern scientific method is empirical in subscribing to verificationism, namely that you should not believe something unless it is proven with absolute certainty from sensory data. This leads to the decline of metaphysics. This idea still preserves, Locke's empiricism still preserves Enlightenment realism, which is later rejected by Immanuel Kant's phenomenology. This is to say that John Locke thinks that the world is real and we can have real knowledge of it. We can have an accurate understanding of reality. Later on, Immanuel Kant is going to say that even sensory data is fallible and we cannot know the nature of things in themselves. We can only know how they appear in our mind. We'll cover that in a later video. Now let's go over Leibniz's criticism of Locke. Let's give her some preliminary comments, though. Leibniz directly responds to Locke, and he claims that he is like Leibniz claims that Leibniz is like Plato, in affirming innate knowledge, and Locke is like Aristotle in starting with sense experience. This is only true in a terrible oversimplification. You see, Aristotle affirmed both observation and reason as working together to produce knowledge and test whether an argument is true. He affirms that logic and perhaps other things are innately known. Locke denies all innate knowledge, and Leibniz emphasizes experience more than Plato but less than Aristotle. You see, Leibniz agrees with Locke that sense experience is required for knowledge. We'll see how this plays out. But Leibniz does not mean that all knowledge comes from experience. All right? So Leibniz still holds experience as valuable, but that does not mean that all knowledge comes from experience. Instead of tabula rasa, blank slate, like Locke proposed, Leibniz asks us to imagine a block of marble that a sculptor will use. This block of marble has veins inside, so that the sculptor only needs to chip away to reveal what is already inside. In the same way, experience is needed to help us recall what we already know. We are born knowing certain things, such as the laws of logic, or some principles in math, or some principles in ethics, let's say. We are born already knowing these things. But we don't know that we know until the situation causes us to ask questions. Sometimes we don't know answers until we don't know that we already know answers until we ask the questions. And the situations prompt us to ask a question. It's like a song you forgot until you heard the first few words on the radio. We all know that things change because of cause and effect. For example, that is one example of innate knowledge. Another one is that something cannot be true and false at the same time. That's another piece of innate knowledge. Or that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or that we should do good and avoid evil. These are things that Leibniz says are innate knowledge. But we don't know that we know these things until the situation calls them to our mind. Kind of like the song on the radio. We didn't know that we still remembered that old song, but then once it started on the radio, we were surprised to find that we had the whole thing already memorized. But we don't know that we know these innate things until we have experience and reflection. So back to the sculpture example. With the block of marble that has not yet become a statue, the statue really actually is inside there somewhere. But experience comes and chips away at things and reveals our knowledge. Leibniz says that Locke says ideas which do not originate in sensation come from reflection. But reflection is nothing but the attention to what is within us. And the senses do not give us what we carry with us already. So Leibniz is saying that Locke contradicts himself, because Locke says reflection is necessary, and Leibniz says that if reflection is necessary, reflection reflects on our innate knowledge already inside of us. In other words, if we don't already have the basic structure of logic in our mind from innate knowledge, we could not learn from experience by induction. Leibniz says, we are not always aware of our acquired dispositions or of the contents of our memory, and they do not even come to our aid whenever we need them. Sometimes we're trying to remember something, we're trying to remember that word or that concept, or something is on the tip of our tongue. We know that we know it, but for some reason we just can't call it to mind in the moment. That doesn't mean we don't know it. Just means we have difficulty sometimes calling it to mind. Alright, so this quote here, we are not always aware of our acquired dispositions or of the contents of our memory, and they do not even come to our aid whenever we need them, though often they come readily to mind when some idle circumstance reminds us of them, as when hearing the opening words of a song is enough to bring back the rest. He also says, although the senses are necessary for all our actual knowledge, they are not sufficient to provide it all. since they never give us anything but instances, that is one event and then another event, that is particular or single truths. But however many instances confirm a general truth, they do not suffice to establish its universal necessity, for it does not follow that what has happened will always happen in the same way. What is he saying here? He's saying, for example, if something happens in the same way over and over again, it takes an additional act of judgment based on innate knowledge to know that this thing should be called, let's say, the law of gravity, right? The law of gravity is the pattern that we see in the world, and it's an additional judgment that is separate from the individual apple or ball or leaf that we see fall to the ground. But if all of our information only comes through senses, then all we have is the ball falling down, the leaf falling down, and the apple falling down. It takes an additional act of judgment to draw out the pattern of gravity and understand these universal kind of things based on the logic that we have in innate knowledge. Induction, one type of reasoning, requires innate knowledge. Innate knowledge is awakened by experience. Induction is just the observation of patterns. You see, induction is already there. The ability to do induction is already in there. You just have to chisel it out, right? We have all this knowledge of logic or even of ethics. We just have to chisel it out through experience and interacting with others. Now let's look at the place of science in philosophy. We've mentioned the influence that John Locke has on empiricism, which becomes the foundation of the modern scientific method. But let's talk about science and philosophy. First, what is proof? How do we prove something? Just think about that idea of proof. What comes to your mind immediately with that word? Proof. How do you prove something? Does something have proof? We usually think of proof as referring to the scientific method where scientists gather evidence from the physical world. The modern scientific method is built on John Locke's empiricism, which says that we learn everything through our senses and that something is true only if it can be proven with sensory data. This assumes naturalism, the theory that the universe is composed of physical matter and nothing else. Proof is seen as physical evidence, and nothing can be known beyond what we learn through our senses. But let's ask whether other methods of proof might be used besides sense experience. What cannot be proven by science if science is understood as this naturalistic empiricist scientific method? What cannot be proven by science? First, what are the elements of the modern scientific method? Let's get that down before we move on into what science can and cannot do. All right? So the scientific method first includes systematic observation, and then based on that observation, you make a hypothesis, a guess, about why things act in the way that they do. And then you run an experimental test whose results can be measured, and you compare something that is an experimental group with a control group in order to provide consistency and an accurate measurement. And then after you've run your experiment needs to be able to be repeated by others. If it cannot be repeated by others, then it remains unproven. It remains just a theory. It has to be repeatable. So what can science not prove? What is outside of science that relies on non-sensory evidence? All right? Just think for a minute. Come up with a couple things in your mind. I'll give you a second. Just list 3 things. All right, now I'm going to list a couple. First is history. History is not repeatable. We can't sense it. We can't see what is happening in the past. We cannot feel it. What we do is we look at the effect of things. For example, we go to a crime scene, or we go to a house. We see broken glass. We see blood on the ground, we see a knife, but that's all we see. We see the effect. We do not see the cause, and we do not see the event actually taking place. So then what we do is we give a probabilistic judgment of what might have been the cause in the past. So we look at evidence today and make a judgment about the past. But the past is not actually repeatable. We cannot actually see the past or feel the past. So it is a sort of educated guess. And because it's a sort of educated guess, people propose good and bad reasons for why they think history functioned in a certain way. What happened in the past? People argue about what happened in the past because they argue about how to interpret the evidence. Because all we have today, ultimately all science is the collection of evidence. Interpretation of that evidence is an additional step that goes beyond science. What about free will? Do we have free will? How do we use free will? How does free will relate to cause and effect? Science cannot answer those questions, or even say that we do have free will, or that we do not have free will. What about art? The value of art, or its purpose, or why do we even do art in the first place? Science does not answer this. This is outside the realm of science. Now, it's important to understand that these things are not outside of reason. And you can still have arguments for why you believe what you believe. And we can compare those arguments and find out whose arguments have better justification for beliefs. So we can still provide evidence through reason and through logic, even if not all of the evidence is stuff we can pick up and look at or feel or taste and see with our senses. Another one, what is personhood, right? And does it apply to fetuses? Does it apply to those who are in a vegetative state in a coma? What is personhood? Is it attached to the DNA of being human, or is it a social invention and conferred upon somebody as they interact in society? What is personhood? What about God? Can science prove God? Or even if it can, or maybe it cannot, then what about all of the things that God says in particular religions, right? So how do you compare one religion to another religion to figure out which one is correct, which one more accurately represents reality? Well, you can't just rely on science. This is not saying that religion is opposed to science. It is saying that in order to investigate religion, we need not only science, but much more than science can provide. What about gender? Is gender scientific fact, or is it a social fact? What about good and evil and the meaning of life? Can science talk about these things, discover or invent, or even find any meaning to these words, good and evil, and the meaning of life? They are beyond, ethics is beyond the scope of science. Or even logic. Logic is the foundation of math. Math is just an extension of logic. And science assumes math. It does not prove math, and it does not prove logic, because logic is more basic than science. Science assumes logic. Science cannot prove logic. So if all of what we know comes from sensory experience through the scientific method, and that we can only prove things with the scientific method, then what about logic? Can we even prove logic? And my favorite one, the scientific method cannot prove the scientific method. The scientific method cannot prove that the scientific method is itself an accurate way to learn about reality. It cannot prove itself, or else that would be circular reasoning. So this shows that the scientific method is built upon more fundamental philosophy. The scientific method is the result of a lot of philosophy that came before it. And even the modern scientific method is not the only type of scientific method. What we call science is usually actually just physical science, an extension of the philosophy of nature. So let's look at the divisions of philosophy to see where science places within the broader scope of other fields of study in philosophy. We have metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology as the main branches of philosophy, and each are subdivided into a bunch of different categories. Metaphysics investigates the nature of reality. Starting at the top, ontology investigates being and existence. What are those words and what do they mean? What do they refer to? Essences. Cosmology refers to how the world is organized. Things like cause and effect, or necessary and contingent, or movement. Things like this, or time. Theology investigates whether or not there is such a thing as God, what the nature of God is, and what the implications of the existence of God might be, such as what God may have said or may not have said. Anthropology studies humanity. Do we have some sort of essence? What is ethics? What about the meaning of life? Is that built into who we are as people? Do we have free will? That's anthropology. And so we have from that psychology and sociology. Those are some other sub-branches. And last, we have the philosophy of nature, which is to say, ultimately, physics and all of the other physical sciences. So you see, and then we have epistemology. The scientific method is a type of epistemology. Empiricism is a type of epistemology. And there are other types of epistemology. As we said, Aristotle emphasizes not only observation, but also a robust cooperation with reason. And so he proposes a different sort of scientific method. And then we have axiology, which is the study of values divided into aesthetics, which is art, and beauty, what is beauty, and ethics, right? So there's a lot going on that is outside the realm of science. So when you trust scientists, I could say, at any given moment, I could say, scientists say, and then say whatever I want afterwards, and people will just tend to believe me because we have identified proof as referring only to physical evidence rather than logical evidence and the rest of philosophy. So we have such a high view of science, and when we do that, then sometimes scientists try to step outside the bounds of the philosophy of nature, of physical science, and say things like whether or not God exists, or things about ethics, or beauty, or belief, or the meaning of life. But those are other areas of philosophy, and certainly you cannot escape philosophy even while doing physical sciences. But it's important to see the relationship here, and that we cannot prove everything from just sensory data alone. We cannot even prove sensory data. We cannot even prove that the scientific method is accurate by using the scientific method. Now let's do the write-up on Locke and Leibniz on innate knowledge. Do you think all knowledge comes through the senses? Do you think that proof only refers to physical proof? What other kinds of proof can there be? What things are outside the scope of science? What things cannot be proven with repeatable physical experience? So try to come up with your own answers and your own examples, separate from what has been shown in this video.